Hi, I'm Zara Blackwood. And last Tuesday, my brother Marcus sent a company-wide email telling everyone I'd been terminated for incompetence. By Friday, Apple's head of recruitment was calling about a vice president position starting Monday morning. The humiliation Marcus thought would destroy me became the catalyst that launched me into the career I'd only dreamed of. But the real story isn't about the job. It's about discovering that the person sabotaging my success had been sitting across from me at family dinners my entire life, wearing the mask of brotherly concern while systematically dismantling everything I built. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was personal, calculated, and designed to keep me small. For years I thought I was fighting imposter syndrome and bad luck. Turns out I was fighting Marcus. And when he finally overplayed his hand thinking he'd landed the killing blow, he accidentally handed me the evidence I needed to expose everything. Now he's the one scrambling to save his reputation while I'm preparing for the biggest opportunity of my life. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept wrapping my fingers around the ceramic mug anyway, letting the phantom warmth ground me in my cramped Portland apartment. Outside, rain pelted the windows with the kind of persistence that made everything feel gray and endless. It was Tuesday evening, and I should have been celebrating. Instead, I was staring at my laptop screen, reading the most professionally devastating email of my life. Subject: Personnel Update. Zara Blackwood, departure from Marcus Blackwood, Director of Operations, Pinnacle Solutions Team. Effective immediately, Zara Blackwood is no longer with TechFlow Dynamics. Please redirect any pending projects or communications accordingly. We wish her well in her future endeavors. Best regards, Marcus Blackwood. The email had been sent to every major tech company in Portland's Silicon Forest, every recruiter I'd ever worked with, every professional contact I'd spent 5 years carefully cultivating. My brother had made sure of that by including nearly a dozen companies in the CC line, disguised as a routine personnel notification that looked official enough to be believed. I scrolled down to the replies that had already started trickling in. Surprise from former colleague, concern from a few friends, awkward silence from most. The damage was surgical and immediate, exactly what Marcus had intended. My phone buzzed against the wooden table, a text from my college roommate who now worked at Intel. Zara, what happened? Just saw Marcus's email. Are you okay? I set the phone face down and closed my eyes. The apartment felt smaller than usual, pressing in around me like a cardboard box. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in this shoebox of a place while Marcus lived in his sprawling Lake Oswego house with the Tesla in the driveway and the view of the mountains. The house our parents helped him buy when he landed his first management role at 26. The same parents who'd suggested I start smaller when I'd asked for similar help at 28, despite having better credentials and a more impressive track record. But this wasn't about money or real estate. This was about something much more fundamental. This was about Marcus making sure I never climbed high enough to cast a shadow over his carefully constructed image as the successful Blackwood child. The worst part was how normal it had felt when it happened. 3 days earlier, I'd been sitting in TechFlow's break room, eating a sad desk salad and scrolling through industry news, when Marcus had called. His voice carried that particular tone of concerned authority he'd perfected over the years. Part big brother, part professional mentor. Zara, I heard some troubling things about your performance review, he'd said, dispensing with pleasantries. Look, I know we don't always see eye to eye, but I care about your career. There are rumors floating around that TechFlow might be making cuts, and your name came up in some conversations I probably shouldn't have been privy to. I'd felt my stomach drop. What kind of conversations? The kind where they question whether someone's a cultural fit. Listen, I have some connections who might be able to help you land softly if you get ahead of this thing, but you'd need to resign before they have a chance to document anything official. The concern in his voice had seemed genuine. The brotherly protection I'd craved my entire life finally extended when I needed it most. I'd thanked him, hung up, and spent the next 2 hours crafting a resignation letter that preserved my dignity while opening the door for a graceful transition. I'd submitted it that afternoon, effective immediately. By Thursday, when I still hadn't heard anything about severance packages or exit interviews, I'd started making calls. TechFlow's HR director had sounded genuinely confused when I asked about the performance concerns Marcus had mentioned. Zara, your last review was outstanding. You were actually being considered for a senior architect position. I'm honestly surprised you resigned so suddenly, especially right before the promotion announcements. The realization had hit me like cold water. There were no performance issues, no cultural fit concerns, no impending layoffs. Marcus had manufactured the entire crisis, convinced me to resign from a job I loved, and then sent that email to make sure I couldn't easily land anywhere else. Now I sat in my apartment, unemployed and professionally radioactive, while my brother continued to climb the corporate ladder at Pinnacle Solutions, the same company that had mysteriously started winning contracts from several of TechFlow's biggest clients, just weeks after I'd shared some strategic insights with Marcus during a family dinner. Insights I'd developed through months of research and relationship building. Insights that had apparently helped Pinnacle position themselves perfectly to swoop in when TechFlow's partnerships mysteriously began to crumble. I opened my laptop and started typing, documenting everything I could remember. The coincidental timing of Marcus's warning, the convenient way his company had benefited from information I'd shared in confidence, the overly broad distribution list on today's email that went far beyond what any normal personnel notification would require. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the glass with an almost violent insistence. But for the first time in 3 days, I felt something other than despair creeping into my chest. It was anger, clean and sharp and focused. Marcus had been playing a long game, using family loyalty as cover while systematically undermining my career. But he'd gotten careless with today's email. Too confident, too public. He'd finally left fingerprints. My phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, with a 408 area code, Silicon Valley. I almost let it go to voicemail. The last thing I needed was another awkward conversation with someone who'd seen Marcus's email, but something made me answer. Hello. This is Zara. Blackwood. This is Vivian Ross from Apple's executive recruitment team. I apologize for calling so late, but I wanted to reach you directly. We've been following your work at TechFlow, and we have a proposition that might interest you. I sat up straighter, my heart suddenly hammering. I'm sorry, I think there might be some confusion. I'm no longer with TechFlow as of this week. Oh, we're aware of your departure. Actually, that's partly why I'm calling. We've been monitoring several senior architects for a new vice president of product innovation role, and your portfolio caught our attention months ago. The timing of your availability is serendipitous. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, certain I was mishearing something. Vice President. The position reports directly to our Chief Technology Officer and involves leading a team of 40-plus engineers across 3 product divisions. Frankly, your background in scalable infrastructure and your leadership philosophy align perfectly with what we're building. Would you be available for a conversation tomorrow morning? I looked around my tiny apartment, at the stack of bills on the counter and the generic motivational poster I'd hung crooked above my desk. Yes, I managed. Yes, I would be very interested in that conversation. Excellent. I'll send you a calendar invite for 9 a.m. Pacific. We're moving quickly on this, so pending tomorrow's discussion, we'd potentially be looking at a start date as early as Monday if you're the right fit. After she hung up, I sat perfectly still for several minutes, staring at my phone like it might evaporate if I moved too quickly. Apple, Vice President. Monday. The same day, Marcus thought he'd finished burying my career. I'd gotten a call about the kind of opportunity most people spend decades working toward, the kind of role that would put me several pay grades above Marcus and place me in rooms where decisions got made that could affect entire industries. I thought about calling him, about family loyalty and taking the high road and being the bigger person. All the things our parents had trained me to prioritize whenever Marcus's behavior crossed lines. Instead, I opened my laptop and started researching everything I could find about Apple's product innovation division. If I was going to walk into that conversation tomorrow, I wanted to be prepared. If I was going to step into the life Marcus had tried to sabotage, I was going to do it with my eyes wide open. Outside, the rain continued its relentless percussion against the window, but inside my cramped apartment, something had shifted. The victim narrative Marcus had written for me was about to get a very different ending than either of us had anticipated. I just hoped I was ready for what came next, because accepting this opportunity wouldn't just change my career, it would change everything about the relationship I'd thought I had with my family. And based on the lengths Marcus had already gone to keep me down, I suspected he wouldn't take my rise quietly. The email from Apple arrived at 11:47 p.m., containing an agenda that made my pulse quicken just reading it. Technical architecture review, leadership philosophy discussion, strategic vision presentation. This wasn't a courtesy interview. This was the kind of comprehensive evaluation they conducted when they'd already decided they wanted you and just needed to confirm you could handle the scope. I stayed up until 3 a.m. preparing, diving deep into Apple's recent product launches and identifying areas where my background could add immediate value. By the time I finally closed my laptop, I'd outlined a 90-day plan that could revolutionize their development pipeline and potentially save the company millions in redundant processes. As I lay in bed, listening to the rain finally taper off into silence, I thought about Marcus sitting in his expensive house, probably sleeping soundly, convinced he'd neutralized the only family member who'd ever posed a threat to his carefully curated success story. He had no idea that his attempt to destroy me had accidentally freed me to pursue something bigger than anything I'd dared to dream while I was still trying to be the grateful little sister who never outshined her brother. Tomorrow I would walk into Apple's headquarters not as the person Marcus had tried to make me: desperate, damaged, professionally suspect, but as exactly who I'd always been underneath his manipulation, someone capable of extraordinary things, when the limitations were finally removed. The irony was perfect. In trying to bury me, Marcus had accidentally planted me exactly where I needed to grow. The Apple interview lasted 4 hours, and ended with Vivian Ross walking me to the lobby personally, something she mentioned she rarely did for director-level candidates, let alone VP. The technical review had gone flawlessly. My strategic vision had sparked genuine excitement among the panel, and by lunch they were discussing implementation timelines rather than hypothetical scenarios. When Vivian shook my hand at the elevator, she'd smiled and said, "Expect a call this afternoon." I drove back to Portland in a daze, replaying every moment of the conversation. The team I'd potentially be leading was working on projects that could reshape how millions of people interacted with technology. The budget I'd be managing was larger than the annual revenue of most companies. The scope of influence was everything I'd worked toward but never quite believed I deserved. My phone rang just as I pulled into my apartment complex. Vivian's voice was warm with good news before she even spoke. "Zara, I'm calling with an offer." The leadership team was unanimous. "We'd like you to start Monday as Vice President of Product Innovation, reporting directly to our CTO. The compensation package will be sent over within the hour, but I can tell you it's significantly above your current salary expectations." I gripped the steering wheel tight. "Vivian, I have to ask, did you receive any external communications about my departure from tech? Any concerns raised about my performance or character?" There was a pause. "Actually, yeah, we received an email yesterday from someone claiming to be a former colleague, expressing concerns about your reliability and team dynamics, but frankly, it felt suspicious. The language was too polished, too calculated. It read like corporate sabotage rather than genuine concern. Plus, when we reached out to 3 of your actual former colleagues directly, they couldn't say enough positive things about your leadership and integrity." My hands trembled slightly as the pieces clicked into place. Marcus hadn't just sent that personnel announcement. He'd actively tried to poison Apple against me. He'd written a character assassination disguised as concerned whistleblowing, and sent it to one of the most prestigious companies in tech. The audacity was breathtaking. "I appreciate your thoroughness in vetting that information," I managed. "Zara, in my 15 years of executive recruitment, I've learned to spot the difference between legitimate concerns and competitive sabotage. Whatever's going on in your professional circle, someone is threatened enough by your capabilities to try derailing opportunities they're not even aware you're pursuing. That tells me we're making the right choice." After hanging up, I sat in my car, staring at the rain-soaked parking lot. Marcus hadn't just tried to end my career, he'd actively monitored my prospects, and attempted to sabotage opportunities I hadn't even told anyone about. The level of surveillance and interference suggested this wasn't a recent development. This was systematic, calculated, and it had probably been happening far longer than I'd realized. That evening I called my parents to share the news. Mom answered with her usual distracted efficiency, the sound of her evening news program playing in the background. "Zara, sweetheart, how lovely to hear from you. Marcus mentioned you were between opportunities right now. I hope you're not letting pride get in the way of accepting help. You know, he offered to put in a good word for you at Pinnacle." I closed my eyes. Of course he had. The hero narrative, even now. "Actually, Mom, I called to share some good news. I accepted a position at Apple today, Vice President of Product Innovation." The television volume dropped abruptly. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Apple offered me a VP role. I start Monday." Silence stretched across the line. Then Dad's voice, sharper than usual, cutting through the background. "Helen, put her on speaker." "Zara." Dad's voice carried a tone I recognized from childhood, the careful skepticism he reserved for my achievements. "That's quite a claim. Are you certain this isn't some kind of recruitment scam? These technology companies are notorious for inflated titles and empty promises." "It's legitimate, Dad. I flew down for the interview this morning. The offer is real." "Well," Mom's voice had taken on that particular cadence she used when trying to manage family dynamics. "That's wonderful news, dear. I'm sure Marcus will be so proud. He's been worried about you since that unfortunate situation at your last company." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the way conversations about my success always seemed to circle back to Marcus's concern or approval. "Has Marcus told you what happened at TechFlow?" "He mentioned there were some performance issues," Dad said carefully. "Nothing that couldn't be overcome with the right attitude and perhaps a bit more humility about feedback." Performance issues. The lie had metastasized, spreading through my family like a virus. Marcus had rewritten history, casting himself as the caring brother, trying to help his struggling sister, while positioning my resignation as damage control rather than manipulation. "Dad, there were no performance issues. I was actually being considered for a promotion before I resigned." "Now, Zara," Mom's voice carried that familiar note of gentle correction, "you know how these situations can feel different from the inside. Sometimes feedback feels harsher than intended. Marcus only wants what's best for you." I stared at my ceiling, tracing the familiar water stain that had been there since I'd moved in. The conversation was following a script I knew by heart. My achievements questioned, Marcus's narrative accepted without examination, my perspective gently corrected to align with the family's preferred version of reality. "I should probably call Marcus and share the news," I said, testing the water. "Oh, he's actually here for dinner," Mom said brightly. "Marcus, pick up the extension." A moment later, Marcus's voice joined the call, carrying that warm familiarity that had once made me feel protected and now made my skin crawl with awareness of how easily he wore concern as camouflage. "Zara," Mom said, "you had some news. Please tell me you found something. I've been worried sick about your situation." The performance was flawless, genuine brotherly concern, slightly anxious but hopeful. If I hadn't lived through the systematic sabotage of the past week, I might have bought it myself. "I accepted a position at Apple today," I said, watching my words carefully. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Vice President of Product Innovation. The silence that followed was different from my parents' surprised pause. This was calculated, processing. I could almost hear Marcus recalibrating his response, shifting from his prepared script about helping his struggling sister to damage control mode. "Wow," he finally said, and I caught the slight strain beneath his enthusiastic tone. "That's incredible, Zara. How did this opportunity come about?" "I thought you mentioned you were having trouble with your professional reputation after the TechFlow situation." There it was, the subtle undermining, delivered with just enough concern to sound supportive, planting doubt in our parents' minds about the legitimacy of my opportunity, while positioning himself as the informed source of my professional struggles. "Actually, Apple reached out to me direct. They'd been monitoring my work for months, apparently." "That's wonderful," Marcus said, though something in his voice had shifted. "I have to ask, though, Did they do a thorough background check? Sometimes these big companies move fast and skip steps. And given the circumstances of your departure from TechFlow, what circumstances, Marcus? Another pause. Longer this time. Well, the performance concerns. The way things ended. I'd hate for any of that to catch up with you later if they didn't do their due diligence. I felt something click into place, like a puzzle piece settling into its inevitable position. Marcus wasn't just trying to undermine my new opportunity. He was creating a narrative where my success was built on deception, where Apple had made a mistake that would inevitably be corrected. He was already laying groundwork to explain away my achievement when it became impossible to ignore. What specifically did you tell Mom and Dad about my departure from TechFlow? Just that there were some challenges with feedback reception and team dynamics. Nothing that couldn't be improved with the right mentorship. Each word was chosen carefully, professionally vague enough to sound reasonable while carrying implications that painted me as difficult, defensive, and in need of guidance. It was masterful in its subtlety. That's interesting, I said, keeping my voice level. Because TechFlow's HR director told me I was being considered for a promotion before I resigned. My last performance review was actually outstanding. Well, Marcus's voice carried a note of gentle condescension. Sometimes there's a difference between official documentation and informal feedback. You know how these things work. People don't always put concerns in writing. Right, I said slowly. Informal feedback that no one documented but somehow prompted you to warn me about impending termination. I was trying to protect you, Marcus said, his voice taking on a slight edge. Look, this Apple thing sounds great, but maybe we shouldn't get too excited until you actually start and see how it goes. These tech giants can be pretty demanding, and given your recent struggles— What recent struggles? Specifically, the question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel the conversation shifting, the careful balance Marcus maintained between support and sabotage beginning to tip toward something more honest. Zara, Mom interrupted, her voice carrying a warning tone. I recognized from childhood. Let's not turn good news into an argument. Marcus has been nothing but supportive during your difficult time. My difficult time, I repeated. The one that apparently involved performance issues at work that my former employer has no record of. Sometimes Dad's voice cut in with finality. Success requires accepting feedback gracefully rather than challenging every piece of guidance offered in good faith. Marcus has more experience in leadership roles. Perhaps a little humility would serve you well in this new position. The conversation ended shortly after, with strained congratulations and promises to celebrate when my schedule allowed. But as I hung up, a different picture was crystallizing in my mind. This wasn't about one email or one incident of sabotage. Marcus had been carefully constructing a narrative about my professional inadequacies for months, maybe years. Every family dinner where he'd offered unsolicited career advice, every casual comment about my work challenges, every suggestion that I needed guidance. It had all been building toward this moment where my family would accept his version of my failure without question. The next morning I decided to test a theory. I called my cousin Derek, who worked at Intel, and had been present at several family gatherings where Marcus had discussed my career. Derek, I wanted to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. What has Marcus told you about my work situation over the past year? Derek hesitated. Zara, I don't want to get in the middle of family stuff. Please, it's important. Well, he's mentioned that you've been struggling with authority issues at work, taking feedback poorly, having trouble with team collaboration. He seemed really concerned about your defensive attitude and suggested you might need some coaching to improve your professional presence. Authority issues, defensive attitude, professional presence problem. None of it was true, but Marcus had been planting these seeds across our extended family, creating a foundation of concern that would make any future failures seem inevitable and any successes seem surprising. Has he said anything recently about performance problems or potential termination? At Aunt Carol's birthday party last month, he mentioned he was worried about your job security, said you'd been getting some tough feedback and might need help transitioning to something more suited to your skill level. My skill level, the patronizing phrase made my jaw clench. Marcus had been preparing our entire family for my professional downfall months before he'd even created the crisis that forced my resignation. Derek, In all the conversations you've had with me about work, have I ever complained about feedback or mentioned conflicts with authority? A long pause. Actually, no, you've always seemed pretty happy with your career, confident, even, which is why Marcus's concerns seemed so what? So unlike the person I know you to be. I thanked Derek and hung up. My suspicions confirmed. Marcus hadn't just sabotaged my current opportunity, he'd been systematically undermining my reputation within our family for months, creating a narrative where my failures would seem predictable and my successes would seem accidental or temporary. The pattern was becoming clear, stretching back further than I'd initially realized. I started thinking about other moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried different weight. The way Marcus had always managed to shift family conversations away from my achievement, how he'd consistently offered help I hadn't asked for while subtly implying I needed guidance. The way he'd positioned himself as my professional mentor despite having less experience in my field. I pulled out a notebook and began documenting everything I could remember. The timeline of Marcus's interference, the specific language he'd used to describe my supposed shortcomings, the way he'd leveraged family loyalty to position himself as a concerned source rather than a competitive threat. By afternoon, I had filled 8 pages with examples spanning 3 years. 3 years of careful, systematic reputation management, designed to ensure that when Marcus finally made his move to destroy my career, everyone who mattered would already believe I had it coming. The scope of the deception was staggering, but now that I could see the pattern clearly, I realized something Marcus hadn't counted on. His very thoroughness had left traces everywhere. Every conversation where he'd planted doubt about my capabilities, every family gathering where he'd positioned himself as my concerned protector, every professional contact he'd poisoned against me while wearing the mask of brotherly support. He'd been so careful to build his case that he'd created a paper trail of his own manipulation, and starting Monday I'd have the resources and platform to do something about it. As Vice President of Product Innovation at Apple, I wouldn't just be Zara the struggling sister anymore. I'd be someone with influence, connections and credibility that Marcus couldn't simply dismiss or undermine. The game was about to change, and Marcus had no idea he'd accidentally armed me with everything I needed to expose the truth about what he'd been doing to me and quite possibly to others for years. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. I spent Saturday shopping for a wardrobe that matched my new role, trading my collection of business casual pieces for clothing that commanded the kind of respect I'd never thought I deserved. Sunday was dedicated to reviewing Apple's organizational structure and identifying key relationships I'd need to build quickly. But underneath the practical preparation, something deeper was shifting. For the first time in years, I was planning a career move without considering how it might affect Marcus's feelings or disrupt family harmony. I was choosing my own success without filtering it through someone else's comfort level. Monday morning arrived gray and crisp, typical Portland weather that somehow felt charged with possibility. As I drove toward the freeway that would take me to my new life, I thought about Marcus waking up in his Lake Oswego house, probably preparing for another day of managing his reputation and expanding his influence at Pinnacle Solutions. He had no idea that the sister he'd tried so hard to keep small was about to become the most successful person in our family. More importantly, he had no idea that his attempts to destroy me had accidentally taught me how power really worked and how to recognize when someone was using it against me. The rain started falling as I merged onto I-5 South, each drop against my windshield like a benediction for the old life I was leaving behind. By the time I reached Apple's campus, the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in sharp, crystalline light. I walked through those glass doors not as the person my family thought I was, struggling, defensive, in need of guidance, but as exactly who I'd always been underneath their limitations. Someone capable of extraordinary things when the constraints were finally removed. The irony was perfect. In trying to bury me, Marcus had accidentally planted me exactly where I needed to grow. 3 weeks into my tenure at Apple, I was sitting in my corner office, reviewing quarterly innovation metrics, when my assistant Tyler knocked on the glass door. His expression carried that particular mix of curiosity and concern that usually preceded interesting news. "Zara, there's someone here to see you. Says he's your brother. Marcus Blackwood, from Pinnacle Solutions. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's been waiting in the lobby for over an hour. I set down my tablet and looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Apple campus below. Marcus had never visited me at work before. In fact, during my 5 years at TechFlow, he'd shown no interest in my professional environment or achievement. His sudden appearance felt like a chess move in a game I was only beginning to understand. "Send him up," I said. "And Tyler, would you mind staying within earshot? I have a feeling this conversation might require a witness." Marcus walked into my office 15 minutes later, carrying his usual air of casual authority, but something was different. His smile seemed forced, and his eyes kept darting around the space, taking in the executive furniture, the view, the obvious markers of a position that commanded serious respect within the tech industry. "Incredible," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. "I have to admit, Zara, when Mom told me about this Apple thing, I thought maybe you were overselling it a bit, but this," he gestured around the office, "this is really something." "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "What brings you to Cupertino, Marcus?" "Well, I was in the area for some client meetings, and I thought it was time we had a proper conversation. Clear the air about recent events." He leaned back in his chair, adopting the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "I know things got a bit heated after your departure from TechFlow, and I want to make sure there are no hard feelings between us." I studied his face, looking for the way his left hand tapped against his knee suggested nervous energy beneath the casual exterior. The slightly too bright smile indicated he was working harder than usual to project confidence. "Hard feelings about what, specifically?" "Come on, Zara, you know what I'm talking about. The way you blamed me for your situation at TechFlow, the accusations about my trying to help Pinnacle win those contracts. Look, I get it. Losing a job is stressful, and people need someone to blame. But now that you've landed on your feet, surely you can see I was just trying to look out for you." The gaslighting was smooth, professional even. Marcus had refined his technique over the years, learning to reframe his interference as protection while positioning any resistance as emotional instability. But sitting in my VP office, with the resources and credibility of Apple behind me, I felt something I'd never experienced in previous confrontations with Marcus: complete clarity about what was actually happening. "Marcus, let me ask you something. When you sent that email announcing my departure from TechFlow, why did you include so many external companies in the distribution list?" His smile flickered for just a moment. "That was standard protocol for personnel announcements. You want to make sure all relevant parties are informed." "Interesting, because I checked with TechFlow's HR department, and they said they never authorized any external communication about my departure. In fact, they were quite surprised to learn that someone had been representing themselves as authorized to speak on behalf of the company regarding personnel matters." Marcus's hand stopped tapping. "I think there might be some confusion about corporate communication policies." "There's no confusion," I interrupted. "I also spoke with several of the recipients of your email. Apparently, you followed up with additional communications, expressing concerns about my reliability and professional conduct. Communications that Apple shared with me as part of their background verification process." The color drained slightly from Marcus's face. "Zara, I think you're misunderstanding." "Am I? Because I have copies of everything, Marcus. The emails, the text messages to family members, the conversations with mutual contacts. It's all quite well documented." I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. The display showed a carefully organized folder containing screenshots, email forwards and conversation summaries spanning several months. The evidence of his systematic campaign to undermine my reputation, laid out in chronological order. Marcus stared at the screen for several seconds, his casual demeanor evaporating. "This is what you've been doing with your time, building some kind of conspiracy theory about your own brother trying to help you." "Help me?" I closed the laptop and leaned forward. "Marcus, you convinced me to resign from a job where I was about to be promoted. You then sent unauthorized emails, claiming to represent my former employer. You attempted to sabotage my relationship with Apple before I'd even interviewed. You've spent months, possibly years, spreading concerns about my professional capabilities to our family and mutual contacts. In what universe does any of that constitute help?" Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing toward the window. "You're being paranoid, Zara. Success is making you paranoid. Maybe that's the real issue here. You're not handling this level of responsibility well. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. It was exactly the kind of subtle undermining Marcus specialized in, designed to plant doubt about my mental state while positioning himself as the rational voice of concern. But something had changed in the 3 weeks since I'd started at Apple. The constant validation of my capabilities from brilliant colleagues, the daily confirmation that my instincts and decisions were sound. The simple experience of working in an environment where my competence was assumed rather than questioned, it had created a foundation of confidence that Marcus's manipulations couldn't shake. Actually, Marcus, I'm handling it quite well. In fact, my team just delivered a product integration ahead of schedule that's projected to increase efficiency by 30% across 3 major product lines. The CTO called it one of the most impressive rapid implementations he's seen in his tenure here. Marcus turned back from the window, his expression cycling through several emotions, before settling on something that looked almost like desperation. Look, this whole situation has gotten out of hand. Maybe we both said things we didn't mean, but at the end of the day, we're family. That has to count for something. You're absolutely right, I said. Family should count for something. Family should want to see each other succeed. Family should celebrate achievements rather than try to undermine them. Family should tell the truth rather than create elaborate deceptions to maintain power dynamics. Zara, I'm not finished. My voice carried authority I'd never used with Marcus before. You came here today expecting to find the same person you've been manipulating for years. The sister who would accept your reframing of reality, who would choose family peace over personal truth, who would allow you to continue controlling the narrative about her capabilities and worth. Marcus sat back down heavily, his mask finally slipping entirely. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that I know what you've been doing. I have evidence of what you've been doing, and I'm done pretending it's anything other than what it is. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Marcus's breathing had become slightly labored, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead, despite the office's comfortable temperature. You know what the really sad part is? I continued. You're actually quite talented at what you do. Pinnacle Solutions has grown significantly under your leadership. You've built impressive client relationships and delivered strong results. You could have been genuinely proud of your achievements without needing to sabotage mine. I never sabotaged anything, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then how do you explain the timing of Pinnacle's major contract wins, immediately following conversations, where I shared strategic insights about TechFlow's client relationships? Marcus's eyes widened slightly. That's just business, Zara. Companies compete, using confidential information obtained from a family member under the guise of casual conversation. Information that was never intended for competitive use. You're being ridiculous. Those were just normal family discussions about work. I opened my laptop again and pulled up a different folder. Marcus, I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I've realized something. This pattern of using family access to gain professional advantages while simultaneously undermining family members who might threaten your position. It's not just about me, is it? His face had gone very still. What do you mean? I mean, I've been talking to some people, Derek, for instance. Apparently, you've had quite a lot to say about his career decisions over the years. How he's not quite management material. How he lacks the strategic thinking for senior roles. Interesting comments, especially considering Derek has a Harvard MBA and 15 years of progressively responsible leadership experience. Marcus's jaw tightened. Derek is family. I care about his career development. The same way you cared about mine, by ensuring other people saw his limitations rather than his potential. That's enough. Marcus stood again, his composure finally cracking. I came here reconcile, but clearly you've decided to turn success into paranoia and resentment. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe you're not handling this level of pressure as well as everyone thought. The comment was designed to sting, to trigger the old insecurities about my worthiness for the position I'd earned. But instead of doubt, I felt something like pity. Marcus was so committed to his narrative of my inadequacy that he couldn't even recognize when his tactics were no longer effective. You know what, Marcus? You should probably leave now. I have actual work to do. Fine. But when this whole thing comes crashing down, and it will because you're not ready for this kind of responsibility, don't expect me to clean up the mess. After he left, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the conversation. Tyler knocked and entered, carrying a fresh cup of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained outrage. "I couldn't help but overhear some of that," he said, setting the coffee on my desk. "For what it's worth, that was the most unprofessional display of jealousy I've witnessed in 10 years of executive support." "Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate that." "Also," he continued, "I hope you don't mind, but I recorded the conversation. I've learned that when family members show up at executive offices unannounced, it's usually wise to have documentation of what actually transpired." I looked up at him in surprise. "You recorded, with your permission, which you gave when you asked me to stay within earshot, and mentioned needing a witness. I took that as implicit consent to document the interaction for your protection." Smart, careful, professional. Tyler understood the game being played better than I'd initially realized. "Can you send me a copy of that recording?" "Already done. It's in your encrypted files folder." That afternoon, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. I called Derek and asked if he'd be willing to have a conversation about Marcus's pattern of behavior within our family. The conversation lasted 2 hours and confirmed what I'd suspected. Marcus had been systematically managing the professional narratives of multiple family members for years, always positioning himself as the concerned advisor while subtly undermining anyone who might challenge his status as the family's primary success story. Derek had documentation too. Screenshots of conversations where Marcus had planted doubt about Derek's readiness for promotion opportunity. Email forwards where Marcus had shared Derek's confidential career concerns with other family members under the guise of seeking advice on how to help. Phone calls where Marcus had subtly discouraged Derek from pursuing opportunities that might have elevated his profile within the family hierarchy. "The thing is," Derek said during our call, "I always knew something felt off about his advice. It never quite aligned with my actual experiences or feedback from my managers. But challenging Marcus meant dealing with the whole family dynamic, and it seemed easier to just work around it. I understand that completely, but seeing what he did to you, the systematic sabotage, the lies to your parents, the attempt to poison your Apple opportunity, it made me realize this isn't about family concern, this is about control. What do you want to do about it?" "I think it's time the family understood what's really been happening, but I'm not sure how to approach that conversation without it turning into a defensive mess where everyone sides with Marcus because confronting this truth would be too uncomfortable." I thought about my parents' reaction to my Apple news, how quickly they'd accepted Marcus's narrative about my supposed performance issues, how reflexively they'd positioned him as the caring brother and me as the defensive recipient of well-intentioned guidance. "I have an idea about that," I said, "but it's going to require perfect timing and ironclad evidence." "What kind of timing?" "Well, Marcus's engagement party is next month. The whole family will be there, plus his professional contacts and Pinnacle's senior leadership. It's going to be his moment of triumph, the successful son celebrating his personal and professional achievements. And I think it's time for a different kind of celebration, one where the guest of honor gets to experience what it feels like when someone he trusts uses his moment of vulnerability against him." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Zara, are you talking about some kind of public confrontation?" "I'm talking about the truth, Derek. Just the truth, presented at the right moment to the right audience with the right documentation." "That's pretty ruthless." "Is it more ruthless than systematically sabotaging your sister's career while pretending to be concerned about her welfare? Is it more ruthless than lying to your parents about a family member's professional competence? Is it more ruthless than using confidential information obtained through family relationships to gain competitive advantage?" Marcus has spent years using family gatherings and celebrations as opportunities to manage narratives and control perceptions. I think it's time he experienced what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that dynamic. The plan that emerged over the following weeks was elegant in its simplicity. No dramatic confrontations, no emotional outbursts, no behavior that could be dismissed as vindictive or unprofessional. Just a carefully timed presentation of documented facts to an audience capable of understanding their implications. Marcus had taught me something valuable through his manipulation, the power of narrative control, the importance of timing, and the effectiveness of letting evidence speak for itself. Now it was time to apply those lessons in service of the truth rather than its suppression. The engagement party was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to finalize documentation, confirm Derek's participation, and prepare for the conversation that would finally expose the real Marcus Blackwood to the people who mattered most in his carefully constructed world. For the first time since this whole saga began, I felt genuinely excited about a family gathering, not because I wanted to hurt Marcus, but because I was finally ready to stop protecting him from the consequences of his own choices. The game he'd taught me to play was about to end, and he had no idea he'd trained his opponent so well. Marcus's engagement party was held at the Portland Art Museum, a venue that screamed sophistication and success. The main gallery had been transformed with elegant lighting, strategically placed floral arrangements, and catering that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about the evening was designed to showcase Marcus and his fiancée Elena as the golden couple, surrounded by family, friends, and the professional network that had elevated Marcus to his current status at Pinnacle Solutions. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a midnight blue dress that struck the perfect balance between elegant and understated. The 3 weeks since Marcus's visit to my office had been productive in ways he couldn't have imagined. Derek and I had compiled a comprehensive timeline of Marcus's interference patterns, complete with documentation, witness statements, and digital evidence that painted an undeniable picture of systematic manipulation. More importantly, we'd identified the perfect moment for revelation. Elena's father, Robert Chen, was a prominent business ethics consultant who'd built his reputation on corporate transparency and accountability. Elena herself was a compliance attorney at a major Portland law firm. Neither of them would take kindly to learning that their soon-to-be family member had been engaging in behavior that skirted the edges of professional misconduct. The party was in full swing when I entered. Marcus was holding court near the bar, regaling a group of Pinnacle executives with what appeared to be a humorous story, judging by their laughter. He looked confident, successful, completely in his element. Elena stood beside him, radiant in an ivory dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, her engagement ring catching the gallery lights like a beacon of their shared prosperity. My parents spotted me first. Mom rushed over with her characteristic blend of pride and anxiety, the expression she wore when she wanted to ensure family harmony at all costs. "Zara, sweetheart, you look absolutely stunning. Marcus will be so pleased you made it. He was worried you might still be harboring resentment about that little misunderstanding from a few weeks ago." Little misunderstanding. The phrase was so perfectly dismissive, so elegantly minimizing, that I almost admired its efficiency. In Marcus's retelling, his systematic campaign to destroy my career had been reduced to a minor miscommunication between siblings. "How has he been describing our conversation?" I asked. "Well, he mentioned that you seemed a bit overwhelmed by your new position, perhaps reading more into normal family concern than was warranted. You know how stressful career transitions can be. Sometimes we all say things we don't quite mean." Dad appeared with 2 glasses of champagne, extending one toward me with the careful smile he used when attempting to manage family dynamics, preemptively. "Zara, I'm glad you decided to put family first tonight. Whatever professional differences you and Marcus have had, they shouldn't overshadow Elena's happiness." Professional differences. Another masterful reframing. My father had reduced Marcus's deliberate sabotage to a workplace disagreement, something unfortunate, but ultimately resolvable through maturity and goodwill. "Of course," I said, accepting the champagne. "Tonight is about celebrating Marcus and Elena. I wouldn't dream of letting anything interfere with that." Derek caught my eye from across the room and nodded slightly. He was positioned near the gallery's main display area, where the evening's program would include toasts and speeches celebrating the happy couple. Everything was proceeding according to plan. I made my way through the crowd, accepting congratulations on my Apple position from various family friends and Pinnacle colleagues, who seemed genuinely impressed by my career advancement. The conversations were pleasant, but surface level, the kind of social interaction that filled space without revealing substance. Marcus finally noticed my presence about 30 minutes into the evening. He excused himself from his current conversation and approached with Elena at his side, his expression carefully calibrated to project magnanimous reconciliation. "Zara, I'm so glad you came." His embrace was performed for the watching crowd, warm and brotherly for anyone observing from a distance. "Elena, I want you to meet my sister, the one I told you about who just landed that impressive position at Apple." Elena's smile was genuine and warm, untainted by knowledge of the family dynamics swirling beneath the surface. "Zara, it's wonderful to finally meet you. Marcus speaks about you constantly. He's so proud of your success." I shook her hand, noting the sincerity in her eyes, and feeling a pang of sympathy for what she was about to discover about the man she'd agreed to marry. "Congratulations on your engagement, Elena. You both look incredibly happy." "We are," she said, beaming. "And I have to tell you, your brother's support during my bar exam preparation was absolutely crucial. He has such a gift for helping people reach their potential." The irony was breathtaking. Marcus had positioned himself as Elena's champion and supporter while simultaneously working to undermine his own sister's potential. The contrast highlighted the deliberate nature of his choices. He was perfectly capable of genuine support when it served his interest. "Marcus has always been very strategic about relationships," I said carefully. "Strategic is a good word for it," Elena laughed. "He's already thinking 3 steps ahead about everything: wedding planning, career moves, even family dynamic. I've never met anyone so thoughtful about managing all the different pieces of life." Managing family dynamics. Elena had inadvertently identified Marcus's core competency, though she clearly interpreted it as considerate planning rather than manipulative control. "Well," Marcus said, his arm tightening slightly around Elena's waist, "Zara knows I believe in taking care of the people who matter. Sometimes that means having difficult conversations or making tough decisions. But it all comes from a place of love." The statement was directed at me as much as Elena, a subtle reminder of his preferred narrative, where his interference represented caring guidance rather than competitive sabotage. But something in his eyes suggested he was less confident about my acceptance of that narrative than he'd been a month ago. "Absolutely," I agreed. "Taking care of people is so important. Making sure they have accurate information, honest feedback, and genuine support rather than anything that might undermine their success." Marcus's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Exactly. Honesty is the foundation of any healthy relationship." The conversation was interrupted by Elena's father approaching with a small group of business associates. Robert Chen was an imposing figure in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that suggested decades of boardroom authority. "Elena, darling, I want you and Marcus to meet some colleagues who've been eager to congratulate you both." Robert's voice carried the warm authority of someone accustomed to facilitating important introductions. The group included 2 other attorneys from Elena's firm, a tech executive I recognized from industry events, and a woman Robert introduced as Janet Morrison, a prominent business journalist who specialized in corporate governance issues. "Marcus," Robert said, "Janet was just telling me about some fascinating trends in competitive intelligence within the tech sector. Apparently there's been a significant uptick in ethical violations involving the misuse of personal relationships for business advantage." Marcus maintained his composure, but I caught the slight stiffening of his shoulders. "That sounds concerning. What kinds of violations?" Janet leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone discussing her area of expertise. "Oh, it's quite sophisticated. We're seeing cases where individuals cultivate personal relationships specifically to gain access to confidential business information. Family members, romantic partners, close friends, people who trust them enough to share details about their work, not realizing the information is being systematically exploited for competitive purposes." "How terrible," Elena said, genuinely shocked. "I can't imagine betraying someone's trust like that." "The really insidious part," Janet continued, "is how the perpetrators often position themselves as helpful advisors or concerned family members. They'll even go so far as to create professional crises for their targets, then offer solutions that serve their own business interests while appearing to provide assistance." Robert nodded gravely. "It's a particularly cruel form of manipulation because it exploits the victim's most important relationships. The person being targeted often doesn't recognize what's happening until significant damage has been done. Marcus had gone very still, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lip. Elena was listening with the focused attention of someone whose legal training had taught her to recognize patterns of malfeasance. "Have you documented any specific cases?" Elena asked Janet. "Several. In fact, I'm working on a feature article about one particularly egregious example involving siblings in the Portland tech scene. The details are fascinating from a psychological perspective, years of systematic undermining disguised as family concern, culminating in an attempt to destroy the victim's career, just as they were poised for a major breakthrough." The blood had drained from Marcus's face. He set down his champagne glass with slightly unsteady hands, clearly recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond theoretical discussion into something much more personal and threatening. "That's quite a coincidence," I said quietly. "Here we are at a family celebration discussing exactly the kind of behavior that can destroy families." Elena looked between Marcus and me, her legal instincts apparently detecting undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. "Marcus, you're very quiet. This must be upsetting to hear about." "It's just..." Marcus's voice was slightly strained. "It's hard to imagine family members betraying each other like that. I mean, family should be about support and loyalty, not competition. The question is what happens when one family member systematically violates those principles while expecting everyone else to maintain them." Robert was watching our exchange with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades identifying interpersonal dynamics that might affect business relationships. "It sounds like this hits close to home for you both." "Well," I said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. "It's interesting you mention that article, Janet. I'd actually be very interested in reading it when it's published." "Oh, it's not published yet. I'm still gathering final documentation from the sources. But the case is quite compelling. The perpetrator's own communications provide most of the evidence needed to establish the pattern of behavior." Marcus made a small sound that might have been a cough or a strangled protest. Elena turned to him with concern. "Darling, are you feeling all right? You look pale." "I think," Marcus said carefully, "perhaps we should change the subject. This kind of discussion seems inappropriate for an engagement celebration." "Actually," Derek's voice joined the conversation as he approached our group, "I think it's quite relevant. After all, marriage is about trust and honesty. It's important to understand what happens when those values are compromised." Derek had arrived carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone with important information to share. Marcus's eyes widened as he recognized what was about to happen. "Derek," Marcus said quickly, "maybe we could catch up later. This is Elena's night, and oh, this won't take long," Derek interrupted smoothly. "In fact, Elena, I think you'll find this particularly interesting from a legal perspective. Zara and I have been documenting some fascinating examples of the exact behavior Janet was describing. Would you like to see some real-world evidence of how these manipulation schemes actually work?" Elena's professional curiosity was clearly piqued. "What kind of evidence?" Derek activated his tablet and turned the screen toward our group. "Well, for instance, here's a series of emails where someone systematically misrepresented a family member's professional competence to multiple third parties, while simultaneously positioning themselves as a concerned advocate." The screen displayed a carefully organized timeline of Marcus's communications, with dates, recipients, and key excerpts highlighted for easy comprehension. Elena's expression shifted from curiosity to concentration as her legal training kicked in. "This is quite detailed," she said, studying the documentation. "The pattern is very clear. The perpetrator appears to be engaging in deliberate reputation management, designed to limit the target's professional opportunities." "Exactly," Derek said. "And notice how the language consistently frames the interference as family concern rather than competitive sabotage." Robert leaned in to examine the evidence, his business consultant background allowing him to quickly grasp the strategic implication. "This is sophisticated psychological manipulation. The perpetrator is using family relationships as cover while engaging in behavior that could constitute tortious interference with business relationships." Marcus had gone completely silent, his face cycling through multiple emotions as he realized the full scope of what was being revealed. Elena continued studying the tablet, her legal mind processing the implications of what she was seeing. These communications include confidential business information, she observed. Information that appears to have been obtained through personal relationships and then used for competitive advantage. That's right. The really interesting part is how the perpetrator convinced the target to voluntarily share strategic insights by positioning the conversations as casual family discussions. Elena looked up from the tablet, her expression shifting from professional analysis to personal concern. Marcus, some of these email addresses look familiar. Isn't that your Pinnacle Solutions account? The moment stretched like a held breath. Marcus stood frozen in the center of our circle, surrounded by evidence of his own manipulation, facing the legal mind of his fiancée and the business ethics expertise of his future father-in-law. I think, Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, there might be some misunderstanding about the context of these communications. What kind of misunderstanding? Elena asked, her attorney voice emerging fully for the first time that evening. Well, family relationships are complicated, and sometimes conversations get taken out of context. And Marcus, Robert interrupted, his tone carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades identifying evasive responses. These aren't conversations taken out of context. These are documented communications that appear to show a systematic pattern of unethical behavior. Elena handed the tablet back to Derek and turned to face Marcus directly. I need you to explain to me, right now, what your role was in creating these communications. The engagement party continued around us, other guests laughing and celebrating while our small circle existed in a bubble of tension and revelation. Marcus looked around desperately as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Elena, I can explain everything, but maybe we should discuss this privately. No, Elena said firmly. If these allegations have merit, then they affect our relationship and our future together. I need to understand what happened, and I need to understand it now. Marcus's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, his mask of concerned brotherhood finally stripped away to reveal the calculating manipulator underneath. The reckoning he'd so successfully avoided for years was finally arriving, delivered not through emotional confrontation, but through the methodical presentation of documented evidence to people capable of understanding its implications. The game he'd taught me to play was about to end, and he was finally learning what it felt like to be on the losing side. Marcus stood in the center of our circle, his usual composure completely shattered. The confident executive who'd walked into my Apple office 3 weeks ago had been replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. Elena was waiting for his explanation, her legal training evident in the way she held herself patient, but implacable, ready to evaluate whatever defense he might offer. Elena, Marcus began, his voice strained. You have to understand that business relationships in tech are complicated. Sometimes information gets shared in ways that might look problematic from the outside. But stop. Elena's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. Marcus, I've spent 7 years prosecuting corporate fraud cases. I know what deliberate interference looks like, and I know what family loyalty looks like. What I'm seeing in this documentation isn't loyalty. Robert Chen was studying his future son-in-law with the clinical attention of someone reassessing a business relation. Marcus, these communications span several months and show clear intent to damage your sister's professional reputation, while benefiting your own company. That's not complicated family dynamics. That's calculated corporate espionage using personal relationships as cover. You're taking this out of context, Marcus said, desperation creeping into his voice. Zara has always been defensive about feedback, and I was trying to help her understand how her behavior was being perceived. By whom? Derek interrupted. Because I've spoken with her actual colleagues at TechFlow, and they describe her as one of the most collaborative and receptive team members they'd worked with. The performance issues you described to our family don't exist in any official documentation. Elena was scrolling through additional evidence on Derek's tablet, her expression growing more concerned with each swipe. Marcus, There are communications here where you're sharing details about Zara's strategic projects with Pinnacle's business development team. Projects that directly related to client relationships your company subsequently targeted. That's just normal industry knowledge. Normal industry knowledge. Elena's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from nearby guests. She immediately lowered it, but her tone remained steel-sharp. Marcus, I'm looking at an email where you forwarded confidential client analysis that Zara shared with you during a family dinner. You sent it to your sales director with a note saying opportunity for competitive positioning. The documentation was even more damning than I'd remembered. Seeing Elena process the evidence through her legal lens was crystallizing just how far beyond normal family conflict Marcus's behavior had traveled. This wasn't sibling rivalry or professional jealousy. It was systematic exploitation of family relationships for business advantage. Elena, Marcus tried again. I know this looks bad, but you have to consider the broader context of our family dynamics. What broader context justifies lying to your parents about your sister's professional competence? Robert asked. What broader context explains attempting to sabotage her job opportunities while positioning yourself as her concerned advocate? Marcus had no answer. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. The elaborate justifications he'd constructed over months of manipulation crumbled when confronted with direct questions from people trained to identify deception. Janet Morrison, the business journalist, had been quietly observing our conversation with the focused attention of someone recognizing a story unfolding in real time. This is fascinating, she said. We're witnessing the exact pattern I've been documenting. The moment when the manipulation becomes visible to the perpetrator's broader social network. Janet, I said carefully, I hope you understand that this is a private family matter. Of course, she replied. Though I have to say, the psychological dynamics are textbook examples of what I've been researching. The way family loyalty gets weaponized, the gradual isolation of the target, the use of professional sabotage disguised as concern. It's all here. Elena looked up from the tablet, her face pale but determined. Marcus, I need to ask you directly, did you deliberately interfere with Zara's career opportunities? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in our circle was watching Marcus, waiting for his response. The party continued around us, other guests still laughing and celebrating, but our small group existed in a bubble of tension and truth. Marcus looked around desperately as if searching for support or escape, but Robert's expression was coldly analytical. Derek's was quietly satisfied, and Elena's was professionally neutral in the way that suggested she'd already reached her conclusion and was simply providing an opportunity for honesty. I was trying to protect our family's interests, Marcus said finally. Zara was making decisions that could have affected all of us, and sometimes you have to intervene before situations spiral out of control. Whose interests? Elena asked. Because from what I'm seeing, the only person who benefited from your intervention was you. That's not fair, isn't it? Derek pulled up another screen on his tablet. Marcus, you convinced Zara to resign from a position where she was about to be promoted, then used the intelligence she'd shared with you to help Pinnacle win contracts from her former clients. Meanwhile, you told our parents she was struggling with performance issues that no one else documented. How exactly did that protect anyone except your own competitive position? The evidence was overwhelming, presented by people whose professional credibility made dismissal impossible. Marcus had built his manipulation on the assumption that family loyalty would prevent exposure, but he'd underestimated the power of documented truth presented to an audience capable of understanding its implications. Elena handed the tablet back to Derek and turned to face Marcus fully. I can't marry someone who would systematically betray family members while pretending to support them. This level of calculation, this willingness to damage people who trust you, it's not something I can reconcile with the person I thought you were. Elena, please. You're overreacting. Am I? She pulled off her engagement ring and held it out to him. Marcus, you spent months lying to your own family about your sister's capabilities while using information she shared in confidence to benefit your business. If you'll do that to your sister, what would you do to me? The ring sat in her palm like an accusation. Marcus stared at it without moving, perhaps finally understanding that his carefully constructed life was collapsing around him. Elena, we can work through this. No, she said firmly. We can't, because this isn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This is a pattern of behavior that shows me exactly who you are when you think no one is watching. Robert placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. Elena, why don't we step outside for some air? This conversation is over. As Elena walked away with her father, the remaining guests in our circle began to disperse, suddenly finding other conversations more appealing. The party continued around us, but Marcus stood alone in the space that had been filled with accusation and evidence just moments before. Well, Derek said quietly, I think that went exactly as it needed to. Marcus turned toward us, his face cycling through anger, desperation, and something that might have been grief. Are you happy now? You've destroyed my engagement, humiliated me in front of my colleagues, and ruined what should have been the best night of my life. Actually, I said, I didn't destroy anything. I simply provided accurate information to people who deserve to know the truth. Elena made her own decision based on evidence of your actual behavior. This is revenge, Zara. Pure and simple. No, Marcus. Revenge would have been public humiliation designed to cause maximum pain. This was justice, giving people the information they needed to make informed decisions about their relationships with you. Derek nodded. The difference is important. Revenge is about causing harm. Justice is about establishing truth. Marcus looked around the gallery, perhaps finally seeing the party through different eyes. His colleagues were still celebrating, but several had noticed Elena's abrupt departure and were beginning to whisper among themselves. His moment of triumph had become something much more complicated. What happens now? He asked, his voice small. Now you deal with the consequences of your choices, I said. You rebuild relationships based on honesty instead of manipulation. You accept that other people's success doesn't diminish your own worth. You learn to compete fairly instead of sabotaging family members. And if I can, then you'll continue losing relationships until you figure out how to maintain them without controlling and undermining the people who care about you. Marcus stared at us for several more seconds, then turned and walked toward the exit without another word. I watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, just a quiet sense of completion. The game he'd taught me to play was finally over, and the truth had won. Derek and I left the party shortly after, walking out into the cool Portland evening. The city lights reflected off the river, and the air carried that particular northwest combination of pine and possibility that always made me feel hopeful about the future. How do you feel? Derek asked, as we waited for our respective rides. Free, I said, surprised by the accuracy of the word. For the first time in years, I feel completely free. 6 months later, I was sitting in my Apple office reviewing quarterly innovation reports when Tyler knocked on my door. Zara, there's a call for you. Someone from the Portland Business Journal wanting to comment on an article they're running. The article, when it was published the following week, was titled, Tech Executive Resigns Amid Ethics Investigation. It detailed Marcus's departure from Pinnacle Solutions following an internal review that had been triggered by competitor complaints about suspicious intelligence gathering. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of behavior that violated the company's ethical guidelines and potentially several industry regulations. Marcus had resigned rather than face termination, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue new opportunities. Pinnacle's CEO had issued a statement emphasizing the company's commitment to ethical business practices and announcing new policies to prevent similar violations in the future. I felt a pang of something that might have been sympathy reading about Marcus's professional downfall, but mostly, I felt validation that the truth had continued to emerge even after our confrontation at his engagement party. Sometimes justice worked slowly, but it worked thoroughly. Derek called that afternoon to share additional news. Aunt Carol mentioned that Marcus is seeing a therapist. Apparently, Mom finally confronted him about the lies he told regarding your performance at TechFlow. How did that conversation go? About as well as you'd expect. Lots of defensiveness initially, but when she threatened to cut him off financially until he got help, he agreed to counseling. It was a start, though I wasn't holding my breath for dramatic transformation. People like Marcus usually required significant consequences before considering genuine change, and even then the work was slow and difficult. My own life had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and genuine. The Apple position had exceeded every expectation, providing not just professional fulfillment, but a platform for the kind of innovation I'd always dreamed of leading. My team respected my leadership. My strategies were delivering measurable results, and my reputation in the industry was entirely my own creation. More importantly, I'd learned to recognize manipulation when it appeared, to trust my own perceptions, and to prioritize relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The boundaries I'd established weren't walls, they were filters that allowed genuine connection while preventing exploitation. Elena had reached out several months after the engagement party, thanking me for having the courage to share the truth about Marcus's behavior. She'd started dating someone new, a public defender whose commitment to justice aligned with her own values. They seemed genuinely happy in a way that didn't require careful management or strategic positioning. My parents had eventually come around to understanding what had really happened, though the process had been painful and slow. Dad's apology when it finally came was stiff but sincere. Mom's took longer, requiring multiple conversations and considerable evidence before she could accept that her golden child had been systematically manipulating the family dynamic for years. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in my relationship with Derek and several other family members who'd been affected by Marcus's manipulation. We'd formed a kind of informal support network, people who understood what it felt like to have your reality distorted by someone who claimed to care about your best interest. The house I'd bought with my Apple salary was everything Marcus's Lake Oswego mansion wasn't: modest, genuine, and entirely mine. I'd furnished it with pieces that reflected my actual taste rather than any attempt to impress visitors. The garden was small but thriving, and the neighbors were friendly without being intrusive. On weekends I hosted dinners for friends and family members who appreciated honest conversation over performative harmony. Derek was a regular guest, along with several colleagues from Apple and a few friends I'd made through community volunteer work. The gatherings were relaxed, authentic, and completely free of the strategic social positioning that had characterized family events during Marcus's peak influence period. Sometimes I thought about the Zara who'd sat in her cramped apartment 6 months ago, reading Marcus's sabotage email and feeling like her world was ending. That person had believed she was powerless against family manipulation, that challenging Marcus would cost her every relationship that mattered. She'd been wrong about almost everything. The relationships worth preserving had survived the truth. The ones that hadn't were revealed to be based on illusions rather than genuine connection. And the career she'd thought was destroyed had actually been liberated to reach heights she'd never imagined possible. The irony was perfect. In trying to bury me, Marcus had accidentally planted me exactly where I needed to grow. His attempt to control my narrative had taught me how to take control of it myself. His systematic undermining had shown me my own strength. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals become the most liberating revelations. Sometimes the people who try hardest to keep you small accidentally show you exactly how large you're capable of becoming. Marcus had given me an unexpected gift: the knowledge that I could survive his worst efforts and emerge stronger, clearer, and more authentically myself than I'd ever been, while trying to maintain peace with someone who viewed my success as a threat to his own identity. The game was over, and I had finally learned how to win. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.